Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to our webinar today titled What Does Good Governance for Nonprofits Look Like? My name's Sean McDonald and I'll be your moderator for the next 45 odd minutes. Firstly, thanks so much for attending today. We appreciate the effort you've made to be with us here. And during our session, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function if you can. We'll be answering those questions during our session and we'll try to get through as many of those as we have time for. Excuse me. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we hope you do, and as is customary for the Board Pro webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering our 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win a beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Jo Cribb, who will talk about the good governance code that we're talking about today. Jo, over to you.
Welcome everybody to this session looking at the good governance code that we've created through the Community Governance Aotearoa. My name is Jo Cribb and I've been very lucky to be involved in the co-design of this code. My background is in the public services, but now I am a professional director and work specifically in the space around community governance and supporting those who work on for-profit boards. And it's my pleasure to be joined by two fellow, instigators who were quite important to bringing this code to life. I'd like to introduce Susan Huria and then followed by Barry Baker.
Just before we start, I'll do a very short prayer to guide us, give us strength and integrity, and make sure that our descendants and their descendants are sustained. We call Huana Huria ho, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Barry.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everybody. My name is Barry Baker. I co-lead the not-for-profit advisory team at Grant Thornton, and a large part of that work is to talk to a lot of people about governance and try to help them progress in this area. I was very pleased a couple of years back to be brought into this by Jo, completely willingly, and I've learned a lot through the process, including the value of crowdsourcing collaboration. And so today I'll contribute in some small way, but I will take my experiences that everybody I talk to, clients or contacts, we learn from each other and we share. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for that opening, Jo, Susan and Barry. Now, for those that haven't yet met Board Pro, we are a board software provider that serve around just over 20,000 users around the world these days, and we help organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more effectively with our clever software, with less time, and deliver more impact and value for the organization. Now, as much as we are a board software provider, sometimes referred to as a board portal, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with limited resources and constraints. Now, for today's session, please sit back, take as much information in as you can. Excuse me. Everything you see here today will be sent to you via email. A recording of the webinar and a code of the new code, as talked about today, will be sent to you just after the session. So above all, ask questions of our panelists using the questions button at the bottom of your screen. So we've already done the introduction of Susan, Jo and Barry, so I'll move on to our presentation. Jo, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Sean. So what we're going to go through today, we've had the fantastic welcome from Susan, who's opened our meeting and set the tone. What we'd like to do is to give you a background about where did this code come from and how did it emerge and how did we create it? What is its background? What is its whakapapa? And then to actually talk about the mechanics and what is actually in the code and to give you a bit of a flavour about what it is there. Then Susan will talk about how she is seeing the code being used already. It's only been launched for a couple of weeks, but also how you can actually apply it in your board work and how it can support your board work. And then we've got an opportunity to answer your questions, but we also have some insights that I know Barry will share again about some of the barriers perhaps to good governance in the not-for-profit sector and perhaps how the code can help address them. And all of that in 45 minutes. And of course, we really welcome your questions. Please, we'll take them as they come and we'll weave them into our conversation, or that we do have a few minutes towards the end. So that's what we're going to do in our session. But first we have to start with why a code and why this focus on community governance. Now, as Barry alluded to, several years ago, a group of us came together knowing full well that there's in New Zealand, there's nearly 500,000 people who volunteer for boards in their community sector. So they'll be on trusts, incorporated societies, they'll be on committees, but all of them will have a governance function. And that does come with some fairly tough duties and responsibilities, but also expectations from stakeholders, and also the environment that we've been navigating over the last few years is incredibly complex. Many volunteers, as we know, are passionate, they're giving their time, and they really want to make an impact. But often governance is made perhaps more difficult than it could be, or even just not having a great understanding about what governance is or could be, and how it is leadership and how it can add value to an organisation, to a cause and to a way forward. We're also seeing some trends around deregistration, particularly of charities due to poor governance. And obviously that's the worst end of governance failure, when the charity is unable then to proceed with its mission. So a group of us came back together and said, what's out there to support these amazing, or we think of them as heroes, community leaders who are on the boards of their not-for-profits and community organisations. And we found very little emphasis placed on community governance. It's often a very invisible and perhaps even thankless task. We often see, say, in the sports area, the coaches and the administrators, but the team behind this that wrote the grant that meant that the season could go ahead, or who hired the key staff, or who wrote the health and safety plan, all the governance functions, are often invisible, and many people would run a mile before they'd end up on their committee, an perhaps loved part of the world. So we decided that if our community sector was going to thrive, and indeed our communities are going to thrive, we really needed to have a focus and some investment on these amazing, or who we think are heroes who are volunteering in the community. So we brought together a number of key players. We brought together a number of key funders, the community trusts across Aotearoa collectively got them behind us. And I can freely admit, I went to Barry there with my hands out and perhaps was too frightened to say, no, that's a good thing. It's a good thing. And over the period of about 6 months, we co-designed what we call the National Strategy for Community Governance. This is the things that will make the most difference to the most people in our communities who are serving on boards. Again, there was nearly 300 community people who serve on boards and communities contributed to those co-designs, and we created a fairly impressive strategy. One of the actions in the strategy was a realisation that across our whole motu, individual boards are having to work out what is good and having to create a standard for themselves, or just try and work out what governance is in their context. And it seemed really inefficient not to have some sort of standard somewhere that was designed by the community for the community that said, hey, this is what good governance looks like. These are the principles, and provide some sort of tool or support to go, how are you going in terms of this code? It is obviously peer driven, so that it needed to be completely created by community sector for the community sector. To start the process, we started with the principles of Te Ao Māori and leadership. So good governance has been defined over thousands of years in Te Ao Māori. Let's start there with those key principles. And then we also did a review of other codes that exist across the world. There is codes in England and Wales, and there's another one in Scotland. Again, the Australian Institute of Company Directors has a code that they created for the not-for-profit sector there. There's also codes in South Africa that are very interesting as well, and did an analysis of what kind of themes or what kind of principles were coming across and what could we learn from that experience. What we learnt was it was incredibly important that the code was grounded in the absolute practical reality of those who are serving, who are busy volunteers, who don't want fancy governance words, don't want long things to read. They want actually practical help to work out how well they're doing and how they could do their job better. So that was where we focused through our review and work of what the key principles were. As a team, we came up with 6 key principles, and then we had co-design sprints where we opened up an open invitation for anyone in the sector to come and be part of those sprints. Again, we got hundreds involved in our sprints, and we put the flesh on each of those principles about what good looks like, What would a board do if they were adhering, paying respects to this principle, and then what actions could boards take? So it's incredibly practically orientated. We do have a slide, don't we, with it's got the 6 principles on it, Sean. I wondered if it's there.
I'll just move to it.
There we go. So these are the 6 principles of the code. That first one is around recognizing and acknowledging that those who sit on boards are actually leaders. You're leaders in your community, you're leaders of the organization. And what good leadership means that you're really clear about the purpose of your organization and that you're absolutely focused on delivering value, so that you have that the board is providing that foundation, that PO and that strategy to move forward. The second principle is very much around that idea of connected or whakawhanaungatanga, that sense of that great boards will understand the relationships that they need. For some, you would frame that as understanding the stakeholders, but that the board is really clear about who it's serving and what they need, and also who is funding and what they need, and what good looks like across all their relationships. So there's an external focus there. The third principle then is around diverse and inclusive leadership, that boards look like and can relate to the communities that they serve, and that you are drawing on a range of expertise in order to be able to do your job and perform effectively as a board. Fourth principle is about manaakitanga, which is that sense of having a deep integrity and accountability to what you're doing, so that you understand that you are there for a purpose and you're always seeking to work with integrity, and whether that be in terms of who you are serving, your relationships, your respect and reciprocity. At principle 5, kaiaki teanga, or open and transparent leadership, is that sense of that you're very open and transparent. This is a reporting, this is a using your money well and seeking feedback and learning as you go. And the last one is that good governance is always underpinned by pono, which is getting the processes right, that you're running robust and effective processes. We think if you can do all of that around your board, you will be absolutely flying as a board. And if we look at, once you have an opportunity to have a look at the code, it is on our community governance website. You'll see that there's an interactive version that has lots of resources to help you and support you to do this. But there's also a downloadable version if you want to take it to your board meetings and use it accordingly. We see it as a live document. We'll be seeking feedback and we'll adjust it as we go. And we have very openly designed it in mind for small to medium organisations. So it's not assuming you've got a huge corporate machine to support the governance. We don't assume there's a technical board, necessarily a board strategy or a board secretary, or there's huge legal help. We're assuming that you are probably very supporting yourself as a board and that you're probably medium-sized, medium turnover. I think, Susan, that's probably a pretty good roundabout. Is that all right? And yeah, we're really interested to hear from you about, okay, this is all good and well. How do we use it?
We have a couple of questions that have come in. Do you mind?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it. Yeah,
right.
Sounds good.
What are some of the barriers to good governance, says Peter?
Yeah, great question. And I know that Barry, particularly, you have some views on that as well. Do you want to fire away before I start?
Yeah, I've got a bit of a list. I'll just pick a couple off the top, because I guess the first part I'll probably summing it is people don't actually understand what's expected of them in governance, and inducting and training your board members both before they start and when they start can be really patchy. I think the second one is not having a shared language or understanding of the expectations or behaviours. And actually, it's having guidance that can help a time poor or resource poor board as well to undertake their duties. I've got about 5 other things too, but that's a starter for 10.
The most important, of course, Barry, is governance to stay out of management or operations.
Actually, I don't actually agree with that all the time, so there might be a topic for another day, but I'm not hard and fast with that. Yeah.
We have a question from Setariki. Can the code be used in the Pacific Island countries also?
We would think that it would be very applicable and hopefully universal, and many of the concepts will relate, but there is an opportunity also to think, particularly the concepts that we've used in Te Ao Māori, how they relate to the worldview and concepts that you would have in your nation and in your own language. But I think the key PO are universal, and we would say, yes, please use it as much as you can. It's there as a gift, as a taonga. But I'll also open up to my others if they've got any other thoughts. Susan or Barry?
No, it's free, so you can adapt it. The concepts are universal, you can adapt those too, but the 6 principles are probably good as a overarching concept, but to break them down over time, I think would be important too as a practical use, because together it's quite daunting to start. So I've seen it used one at a time during board meetings that might run across a year, put into the board work plan so everyone knows in February we'll be talking about whanaungatanga. And that helps it to get on the waka.
Look, I think that's actually a really good point. One of my notes when I'd read the code was that even though this is miles ahead of understanding and practicality of most other codes, there is still quite a lot. And I think the self-assessment tool at the end is a really useful place to start as well. And that'll probably work onto what you're saying, Susan, too. And I think I'm a huge fan of the old nudge and nibble theory. We all know if we're trying to change, it's best to do a little bit at a time. Otherwise, it just doesn't stick. It's really hard to give up those pies. It's best just to do a wee bit at a time.
I'll remember that nudge and nibble, because it is a concept that you can use to have an honest conversation, because it is the board, it's not for operations. If you have about what value you're adding, you should be always asking that if you have a formal sort of governance set up. And then if you're not able to add value, then move over for a change of composition or refresh it so you can. So this helps open up those conversations and have what can be difficult conversations, and especially when it's volunteer, which is double difficult.
Yes.
We have a question from Janine. She says, you may have some further learning on this, but in terms of diversity, how do you create this short of shoulder tapping and possibly biasing and influencing this process?
Diversity.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. You go. You're the expert, Jo.
No, other than Janine, the whole hoe around diversity will give you a whole lot of leads about what we think is best practice in terms of how you can recruit a really diverse board. So hopefully there's lots of really practical tips about how to do that, and what we think is what we've crowdsourced across New Zealand, what we think are great practices. So hopefully all the answers are there in terms of lots of practical tips.
And just one other before we move on to Susan. It says, well done, New Zealand, Australia. Does Australia have an equivalent code for not-for-profit?
So the Australian Institute for Company Directors, their not-for-profit division, has created a code. I don't think it used the process that we did in terms of such wide crowdsourcing, but there is an Australian product. But Margaret, you're welcome to use the New Zealand one. As I say, we think it's quite generic as well.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Susan, over to you.
It's been around a little while, and probably about 6 months in draft, but the final version is, as I said, published now and can be downloaded and distributed. In fact, it is. I asked this morning about the analytics, but it is on a very strong trajectory. It's being shared. The Community Governance Aotearoa have a newsletter, which if you subscribe to, then you will get the feedback, the revisions, the practical use of around the place. So that will be ongoing, plus some further learning and development programs that are going to take place next year. So I'd encourage you to sign up to that one and have a read from time to time. So some of the things that are going on is it's being used as a board evaluation and board appointment tool, and across the 6 PO there's questions that you can use to help with those discussions about have we got the right board for the right time, given how volatile the world is and will stay that way for some time. So that it's being used as a evaluation process. Another one is as a strategic planning tool, so that the board and the management team, if there are management, can work together using the code as a planning tool. Also risk, of course, with that volatile world comes more risk. So everything from cyber, depending on what your systems are, cyber to climate change to finances. Funding is always the number one, I've found, a not-for-profit. So using it to look longer term as a board for funding. So if questions are the language of governance, then getting the right questions through this code as a tool is pretty cool.
We have a question in from Margaret, who says, thank you. As a not-for-profit, I would not have thought to look at the company director's information. That's quite interesting.
Many of the league systems are very similar, just a different act.
Yeah, I think the main difference is, and I see it even with the resources provided, this particular one, which I'm going to be a raving fan of, is I've found it the most easy to digest. Some of the other guidance is actually still quite stilted language. That's a real strength of this particular code as well. It's much more digestible, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed.
Excellent. I'll just move on. So, Jo, the code is now online, or it has been online for 2 weeks now.
Yes, it has. So feel free to use. We'd really appreciate if you even passed it on. As we say, it's a free resource. It's being developed by, as I say, hundreds of volunteers and their hours and their wisdom to help peers. So see it in the generosity that brings. So yes, use it and please pass it on to your networks and those perhaps, when we sit on boards, often our fellow board members also sit on other boards. So there's an opportunity to pass it even to your board to be used in other boards. And we really encourage you to use it to start a conversation at your boards about what good looks like. Many times we're just busy getting the mahi done, right? We're just trying to work out where is the next grant application coming from? How are we going to solve the next problem? Often it's key staff at the moment. How do we recruit? All those kind of issues which are very present. But we often don't take the time to sit there and think about ourselves and our leadership. And I think this is a prompt to do that. And investing in those conversations means that obviously we will potentially even perform at an even higher rate, which means we can lead our organisations even more effectively.
It's being used currently, Jo, in a employing friends and whānau situation on a board, which is part of the whanaungatanga principle. So they're using that to really help them design protocols, set clear expectations, just make it transparent, and especially remuneration, so that there's none of the stumbling blocks that can happen over time with whānau and friends inside organisations.
We have a few more questions, if you don't mind, everybody. From Jennifer. What is currently making good governance in the not-for-profit sector complex?
Compliance. Over to you, Barry. You're the expert.
Oh, yeah, I start to feel like Chicken Little here a little bit, but I think you're right. And unfortunately, even some of the clients we work with and contacts that don't have a good picture of what actually is not working as well. So the stuff they're wrestling with, they're only at the start of this whole process. So if I think about what came out of our survey recently, we're talking about the people side, the risk management, privacy act, that stuff is poorly done just about across the board, but a lot of that ties in together about information, and these are the things that can kill an organization. This is where governance need to look at it from strategic risk. You talked about cyber before, but getting personal information out, getting people to work with or alongside you, but the compliance piece around risk and legal requirements is really high as well. There's a lot, actually.
Can I ask you a tricky question about would that burden spur not-for-profits to merge?
Oh, sorry, a flashback. I chucked out of a conference for suggesting that one year, but I would have said yes, but actually what we're seeing more of now and more encouraging is to co-work together. So instead of just physical spaces, actually sharing those functions, because typically if you've got a risk or a cyber or whatever, if you've got a group of 6 or 7 of you, you can still do the work you need to do, but you can have a centralized way of sharing those costs, because it's really hard if you're small. You think about credit card transactions, that's a huge obligation. How do you even know where to start? So what I'm recommending to people is to collaborate more. I've moved away from the model.
Good answer.
Yeah.
Next question.
Just to answer, one of the things I think I also see, and I think it's a natural result of some of the immediate pressures that are often funding people, as you say, compliance, reporting, all the kind of immediacy that drives it, is that I see a lot of boards who are often quite operational or quite short term. So they're really focused on what's going to happen in the next month or the next month after that or the next year. And really some of the gifts I think a good board can bring to an organisation, but also to a community, is that function of strategy, which for me, strategy is aspiration and dreaming. What are the possible things that could happen, that need to happen for the group of people that you serve? So lifting, I think one of the big challenges is being able to lift us out of the immediacy and actually have that longer term view. And as soon as when I've been working with boards, as soon as you do that, actually a whole lot of things often fall into place because you're much more focused on actually what you're trying to do rather than necessarily chasing pots of money or worrying about things. It actually creates a kind of a framework. If you've got that shared longer term vision about who you're serving and what they need and what your aspirations are, it actually makes the governance role easier in a way, and also I think more rewarding.
And how are you accountable to them, Jo?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's often that closing of the loop where not-for-profits carry on and on over years, but never actually report back to the people they serve in any way, shape or form.
Absolutely.
A question from Valerie, it's just come in. Great to have the code. Does it conform to New Zealand accessibility guidelines, and is it sign language and other languages? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So Valerie, would love feedback on the website. It's being built to those standards. In terms of delivering the code in sign language and other languages, as soon as we can wheedle the money out of someone, which is what I think the team are getting quite good at, that is an ultimate goal.
One from Phil. Kia ora, says Phil. I assume the ethical behaviour sits in the integrity pile. I think many boards struggle with the ethics of issues such as seeking funding from the organisations that receive their funds from alcohol or gaming related activities.
Yep. So yes, there is, and it's a sense of boards having a clear framework, regardless that ethical decisions are ones that usually never have a right or wrong or a factual basis to them. They're values-based, but there is definitely an encouragement of having a framework and a shared understanding about what an organisation stands for and how, say, different funding choices fit within that. And different organisations will be making different decisions according to their frameworks.
This next question follows the earlier one, which was what is currently making good governance in the NFP sector complex? How does the code help? Is the question.
I'll hand that over to Susan and Barry.
Ladies
I
first.
think it
Ladies
doesn't
first, over to you, Susan.
thanks, Sean. It doesn't answer the questions, but it provides a system or a tool to start the discussion. So really it's not prescriptive. There's plenty of other codes out there that are thou shalt, but this is about the board having those open discussions and providing the questions to guide that. So really it's a guidance document.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And I think too, the first thing I thought when I'd read it was to the layout, because we talk about the principles, why it matters, what success looks like. Often things will stop there and then we talk about actions, and they're not prescriptive like you said, but I think even if you are brand new or reasonably experienced, you'll get something out of it. But I really like that layer because I get really sick of reading theoretical books. That's amazing, but how the hell do I actually do it? So I'm definitely a big fan of this. Yep.
Well, that segues into the next question. What are the next steps for the code, Jo?
Sure, great question. Just to add on to Barry's thought, at the end of the code and online, there is a self-assessment tool. So it actually then takes the code and formulates a number of questions that you could use to frame your discussion at the board level. So it gives you the opportunity to actually really actively use the tool, and hopefully that gives you a bit of a framework to do it in your actual board meeting times. So the next step is, obviously we want to share this as widely as we can, and we're working with a number of partners to do that. So hopefully you'll start to see the code coming at you from different directions. Say, for instance, at the Charities Commission, you'll see it coming through their work, through the Institute of Directors have been promoting it very widely as well. We've been working with government agencies. So if you are taking on a government contract, we hope and often in their accreditation process, they have markers around what is good governance. So hopefully you'll see that come through to you there. So we're looking at the different touch points about where we can provide, where the code can provide help and make it easier for organisations and for their boards to succeed. But also a lot of it is dependent on us as practitioners, as board leaders, to sharing it. So I really welcome you if you could use it and share it. And also we'll be opening channels for you to give us feedback. We don't think in no way the code is perfect. We think it'll iterate over time as we learn, as it's used. as governance practice evolves, as our understandings and needs evolved as well. So we think it is very much as a living document.
So just to follow on from that, so if you take Pono, the last one, which is probably born out of most other codes with the and procedures, if you sit around your board, as I've done, and ask the full board, what's your understanding of the legal responsibilities in our sector that we're obliged to follow? But everyone goes, oh, they can't articulate them, but they know what they are. But you just have to keep digging and following that line of, it's the second and third question that can uncover that there is some work to do from the board's perspective on what actually your legal responsibilities are, just to ensure that you comply and don't get in trouble.
Excellent. Well, we're out of questions, everybody.
So I think there's one from Marama that's just come through, Sean, and she's asked a really, I think, quite powerful question about
I missed that.
how the code will support and lead or support a board that is in a very male sport-dominated environment, and how you could use this to have not feeling like your leadership is soft or not direct. So I think this is the perfect tool for that, because this is an expert issued code about what good looks like, and it's quite objective. It's being developed with hundreds of governance experts and governance practitioners. So it's a lovely opportunity to say this is what good looks like. This is being mandated by a whole lot of organisations, including the Institute of Directors in New Zealand, including the Charities Commission. Let's have a run through the code and see how we're doing. So it gives you a nice platform to open up those kind of conversations and a whole lot of hopefully legitimate backing to do. But great question, Marama, and it sounds like you're doing great work in your governance space there.
And of course, Sport New Zealand has a wonderful sort of how-to, the 9 steps. But Marama, if you've got 6 board members, others have taken it to make it achievable. They've given each board member a PO so that they can become focused or expert, or they build their skills in that area. So that sort of makes it a little bit more manageable.
A question from Nina. Do you know if the AC in Australia has a code?
I don't even know what the ACNC is, so that's not a very good answer, is it? I'm sure is that the Charities Commission there?
Yep.
Yes, I haven't heard of that either. From Kate here. Kate asks, do you provide individualised support for board?
Unfortunately, through Community Governance Aotearoa, which is a voluntary organisation funded by the Community Trust, there isn't capacity at the moment to support individual jobs. So there is an amazing mentoring scheme that is running each year for both board chairs and board members. And so that's a lovely opportunity to do that as well. But I'm sure there's lots of others in and around the ecosystem that would be really pleased to work alongside you.
Excellent. That fairly much brings us through to an early finish. So thanks, everybody. That pretty much concludes our webinar today, but not quite. Feel free to connect with our presenters that you see on LinkedIn here. I'm sure they'll look forward to your connection. We have a great range of webinars over the next few weeks and months, and you can learn all about these at our website, which is boardpro.com/resource centre. Our next webinar on the 24th is titled Why a Board Needs a Solid Connection with the CEO, which will be a great topic. That particular webinar is hosted by Lisa Cook, Brett Herk, and Giselle McLaughlin on our discussion panel. And this will be a really informative topic, so I'd highly recommend you make an investment of time for that particular webinar. Now, as I mentioned in the opening, you'll receive an email from us fairly shortly, which will include a video of the session today, the presentation slides, and the code itself, which will be sent through to you in PDF. Please feel free to share this information with your work colleagues and others. We'll also post the collateral to our webinar page in 24 hours' time. So just as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey so you can go into the draw to win that beautiful gift hamper. We'll announce the winner shortly after the webinar today. So thanks again, everybody, for your attendance. I hope you enjoyed the session today with Barry, Susan, and Jo. It was great to have you with us today. And thanks, everybody. See you at our next webinar.